I came across this story that I found that was really inspiring. It's by a pastor in a Baptist church in Georgia. His name is Andy Cook. When 38-year-old Carlotta Bennett realized the water in her house had reached her family's hiding place in the attic, she began to rightly panic. Hurricane Katrina was blowing sections of the roof off her home. Her house was tipped off of its foundation, and the rising waters were threatening to drown the 5 people trapped in the attic. That's when Carlotta's 4-year-old daughter started to pray. And when she finished, they noticed how the water started receding. When the family scrambled down the attic stairs, they found every entrance blocked by fallen pecan trees. Pecan, right? I don't know, we could vote on that, but how you say it anyway doesn't necessarily matter. Carlotta's husband, though, led his family through a shattered window, right? When everyone carefully made their way to a middle school where they would stay for the next 10 days. While seeking safe shelter from the unspeakable devastation, they discovered that 4 neighbors had died in the storm, and many more were injured. The sound of howling winds gave way to the sounds of screaming people and collapsing houses. In the overwhelming shock, they realized they had lost everything. At the middle school, more than 350 people lived without running water or electricity for the next week and a half. Yes, the Red Cross delivered food and water, and families had the opportunity to bathe outside from a garden hose. Only later did they find out that the water was contaminated. Inside the school, toilets refused to flush, and conditions were becoming dangerously unhealthy. And after 5 days, most of the families moved outside to set up camp in the parking lot for 5 more days. With their world in chaos and fading hopes for a rescue, the Bennetts and other destitute families began to pray for a miracle. In the face of such a disaster, it was the only choice they thought they had. To be continued. So for ages, people have been exposed to the destructive power of natural disasters such as earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, and yes, right now, out west, wildfires. Just when one ends, another begins. They've also been affected by evil caused by other human beings, such as crime and violence and all kinds of other things that actually stem from the sin of pride. It's in our nature to ponder the question, why would a God who is all-powerful and all-loving allow such suffering to take place? So as we continue our series in one of the oldest books in our Bible, we note that Job is not afraid to address the concern of what we call theodicy. Now, last week, we looked at chapter 1 and discovered that this righteous man by the name of Job loses essentially everything he has in one short day. Then in today's reading, we hear that God allows Satan, S-A-T-A-N, or what the ancient Israelites actually called Ha-Satan, meaning adversary, not the little red devil with the tail and the horns, okay? Different kind of thing, that culture around it grew. But we're speaking about this character, Satan, okay? God allows Satan now to physically harm Job. Not kill him, right? But make him miserable. Certainly Job was crushed and consumed with the pain of suffering. He had torn his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground when he heard that his children had died back in chapter 1, verse 20. And now he was plagued with physical ailments, and they were so painful, he used broken pottery as instruments to scratch his afflicted sin. Okay, it just reminds me of this time I had a cast. It was before the waterproof ones when I was really little. And you know how you couldn't shower with it? You had to put a plastic bag on it and hold it outside the shower, okay? And then if you had an itch way back in there, what did you do? You used a coat hanger. Yes, right? So, that's the only vision I can get. But Job's cracking pottery to get the shards that are so sharp to scratch the wounds in his own body, right? This isn't small potatoes here. And yet amid his heartache, Job speaks some of the greatest statements of faith ever heard. And he falls on his knees to worship and praise his maker. He says this, "Naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart." You've heard this, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away," right? "But may the name of the Lord be praised." And then he says this later on, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Okay, shall we accept good but not trouble too? I, quite frankly, am amazed that Job was able to hold good in tension and delicate balance with evil. And here are just a couple of insights I want to share with you. Maybe you agree with them, maybe you don't, and that's okay either way. But this is how I think he handled his predicament of pain and suffering. First, in the midst of his grief, not because of his grief, but in the midst of his grief, in spite of his grief, actually, he chose to continue to worship God during a time of utter suffering. Now, just because he worshiped doesn't mean he felt like it, right? I believe it was a very conscious decision out of respect and love and obedience and discipleship to the very one who gave him life. And yet, the pain was still there. Now, you might ask how Job could even choose to have great faith and still feel such great pain simultaneously. But then I wonder, what choice did he have? If we take the risk of loving those around us, the grief will be tremendous if those we love are taken away. So one way of looking at it is perhaps the alternative to grief is to never love at all. And Job was not willing to accept that alternative. Second, Job was able to worship God, praising the name of the Lord in a time of crisis. But as we will see throughout the whole entire book, never did he stop the questioning of why. We can wonder, we can ask, we can even demand answers from God, though we may never get them as we desire. Now, stay tuned for that sermon in a couple of weeks on questioning God. Third, Job remained faithful in the tumultuous times, ultimately affirming that God is sovereign and in control. When we remain faithful during a time of pain and suffering, we are also affirming that we trust in a God who is sovereign and in control. Again, this never diminishes our pain. But in the trials and temptations we encounter, what we can do is shift our focus from the pain itself to a God who loves us unconditionally and walks with us in the darkest valleys of life. What are our options during a time of suffering, you might wonder? Well, you could reject the God who allows such suffering, and believe me, many do. Or we could trust that God remains in control above all evil and all suffering. And though the suffering doesn't make sense, and remaining faithful during a time of suffering seems to make even less sense, placing our hands, placing our life, giving all of who we are to the only God who cares for us in this life and in the life to come may be the only logical action a person can ever take. Seems illogical, but maybe that is really the only logical choice we have. Now, any one of us, and I'm sure we do, sing songs of praise on the good days, right? But funny how often we don't. But it takes a person of tremendous faith and radical spiritual maturity to sing those same songs of praise on the bad days. Job, though, was wise enough to know that God had control over both. Beyond that, Job learned a lesson that must be remembered in a time of suffering. Nothing about our present circumstances, the good the bad, or the ugly has ever changed the true nature of God, because God is still the same today, just as God was yesterday, and just as God will be tomorrow. That same God is always worthy of our praise. Last point. Though he didn't know it yet, he didn't realize this, Job's suffering would actually bring him closer to God than ever before. So be inspired when you are going through challenging times and you may feel that God has abandoned you. The reality is that God is closer than you can even imagine. We'll also touch on this in a later sermon as well. Now let me wrap up the story of the Bennett family who survived Hurricane Katrina. For more than a week, the Bennett family suffered in a forgotten corner of Biloxi. The nation's focus was on how the Hurricane Katrina hit, but mostly on the impact it had on New Orleans. Few reporters waded through the waters of Mississippi to see the damage there, but it was there. Yet eventually those living in that middle school parking lot, they made the nightly news. A pastor in a tiny town in Georgia, a different pastor than the one who actually shared the story of the Bennett family, decided it was time to take action. And he arranged for buses to go to the middle school, which was actually kind of out of the way, to pick up these hurricane victims and bring them to a shelter where 259 people found warm meals, comfortable beds, and clean restrooms, thanks to the donations of local schools, businesses, and churches. And Carlotta Bennett recalls this. It was heaven. It was heaven on earth. And the miracle that they had prayed for had indeed come true. Yes, the hurricane changed their lives, but in some ways for the better. Even though they had endured an inconceivable tragedy, they recognized how God was with them the entire time, particularly caring for them through the kindness and generosity of others. Katrina rocked their world, and they lost everything, but they had walked away with the only important thing, their very own lives. Their predicament of pain and suffering was the beginning of their story, but not the end. The Bennett family had remained faithful, and with the help of a small congregation, experienced the face, the hearts, the hands, and the feet of Jesus. 3 weeks to the day the hurricane struck, the entire Bennett family was baptized. Now, we may never know why we experience suffering throughout our lives, and it may be difficult to sing songs of praise. But my hope is that you choose to praise God anyway, because God truly is worthy, always worthy of our praise, and is always closer than ever, no matter what the circumstances. So I say this day, as we look at the text of Job, all thanks and glory and honor and power be to the God who remains steadfast in walking with us in our predicament of pain and suffering.